We are live. I'm going to post it on Twitter. Okay. And as always, thank you for mentioning it on Instagram because the Instagram app is not getting along with my phone right now.
Oh no.
So I can sometimes repost things, but it gets really cranky if I try and do anything else, basically. Okay. So I figure we can give it a few minutes. Probably just a couple.
I'm just posting on Twitter as well.
Great. YouTube is very helpfully letting me know that we're live.
I love how it does that. It's like, yes, it's on my channel.
Right. It's like, this is maybe the one thing you don't need to give me a notification for. Okay, so this is my copy, by the way. I also
as well.
Yeah, I liked when I was originally reading this a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, I don't remember. The US paperback wasn't out yet, I think, and I also just really liked the UK cover, so that's what I ended up doing.
Interesting. I really wanted the US cover, so I didn't get it for a long time. But then at some point, I was like, I looked back at it again, and I was like, actually, I quite like the UK one, and then I just ended up getting it.
Yeah, and I feel like it's a really good representation of the book and like the feeling. Which, not that the US one isn't, but I think it's a very different vibe for the cover.
Yeah.
Okay, so do we want to go ahead and do intros as people trickle in, or do we want to give it a couple more minutes?
I'm happy to jump in.
Okay.
And hopefully people can get caught up.
Yes. Yes, I know. And I think this is like a little bit different time than usual. So that might be part of it as well. But because it's earlier, I'm hoping that some UK people might be able to join who can't normally. Okay, so hello, everybody. My name is Kara, of course, and we are going to be discussing King and the Dragonflies by Kacen Callender. This is one of our selections for the Not a Genre Book Club, which is my book club I created that is all about reading and discussing middle grade and young adult books with the same kind of attention to detail and themes and depth that classics or adult books often get, which is not to say that young adult and middle grade books never get that, but I do definitely think it is less common. So I created a book club all about it. And my wonderful guest today is Olivia-Savannah. So do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and your channel a little bit? I think I already linked Olivia-Savannah in the description, so be sure to follow her.
Thank you. I'm Olivia-Savannah. My channel is Olivia's Catastrophe, and I read a lot of different types of books, some adult fiction, some young adult, and as you can see here today, some middle grade fiction too.
Yes, we love variety, both of us, so.
Yes.
Okay, so I think we're just going to go ahead and get started, and when people show up, that's great. Let's go ahead. I'm going to start off with talking about the content warnings really quickly, just so people know. This book does deal a lot with grief, homophobia, racism, child abuse, which is off page, but it does come up, and outing somebody. So just know that those things are in the book and they will come up in discussion. So, take care of yourselves if you need to leave. And when people join, feel free to say hi in the comments. Let us know if you read the book and what you thought. This was actually a reread for me, but I know Olivia-Savannah had not read this before. Yeah. So let's just jump in. Do you want to talk about your overall thoughts and impressions on the book?
I really liked it. This is not my first Kacen Callender because I've read their young adult book, Felix Ever After, but I raced through this and I thought it was really, really good. I typically tend to like books with themes of grief in them, and I thought that was handled very, very well. And I recently read a middle grade book called Melissa by Alex Gino, and I think what really struck me about this one is how it's talking about the role of the parent and the child when it comes to coming out, and kind of prepping children for like when the parental reaction is not good, but not good off the bat, and that
Right.
process. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things we're gonna talk about. Yeah, and like I said, I have read this before and I loved it both times. I think it's a really, really excellent example of what we're trying to do with this book club, because it's a middle grade book that does so much in terms of the themes and what it's saying and how important it is for kids to have this kind of book. But it's also, I think, a really well written and compelling story. Um, and actually, going off of one of your points, Olivia-Savannah, this leads perfectly into our first themes question. Nicely done. So this book deals a lot with grief and healing from grief. And I wanted to talk about, how do you think King and his parents deal with the loss of his brother differently? And also, does that change throughout the book? Because I feel like well, just go ahead. I don't want to answer first.
Can we talk? We can talk spoilers, right? We can just delve right.
Yes, I should mention that this is going to be spoiler discussion throughout.
Okay, so I'm just gonna go right ahead and say, like, I think they really, not like they handled it badly in the beginning, but it was a lot of, it felt like miscommunication, but that, I mean,
Yeah.
in a very realistic sense, about the parents kind of wanting to give him time to speak to them when he was ready to speak to them, whereas King wanted them to speak first and didn't really, there was like a mixture of understanding there, and there was a lot of waiting for the other person to speak first in this book, I felt like. And in grief, that can just be very, very isolating, when what you need is for someone to like just give you a hug, to just talk about it.
Yep.
But it also sounds like that was not the nature of their family. They were not one that would express emotions audibly. It would be more so through actions, and that's kind of where it gets a bit difficult, I think, with this one.
Yes. And when you said isolating, I was thinking the same exact word. Because it really does feel like King and both of his parents, it's like they're all going through the same grief, but very separately. And I think that was kind of, an unhealthy way to approach it. And I think, like you said, his parents were, to an extent, waiting for him to, come forward or to say something. But yeah, it's like King is the child, in this situation. And so I think it's a lot to put on him to know that that's what they're waiting for, because and I also think that his parents aren't necessarily dealing with their grief very well. Like, I don't think I don't know. And obviously everyone processes differently, but I do feel like, especially at the beginning of the book, it's almost like they're not processing it, like they're not talking about Khalid. They're not like acknowledging that things are different now, even though they all know that and they all feel that constantly. And it isn't until they start like talking about memories of him, and they start, they go to Mardi Gras again. It's like that kind of, like you were saying, that action is necessary to not move past it, because obviously you never just get over grief, but to process it in a way that hurts less.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the time they were treating King like an adult rather than like a child.
Yeah.
I feel like they understood that he needed to talk to someone, because his mom was always like, do you want to go and see a therapist?
Yeah.
And they just didn't understand that he didn't want to talk to someone he didn't know. He wanted to talk to his parents. And
Yeah.
I agree with you. They're not processing things, but in some ways I felt like they were processing more than King, in the fact that they started to independently jumpstart at least towards the beginning, like jumpstart the moving on, because they were like, King,
Right.
move up on the table, or shall we go to Mardi
Right.
Gras? So they're like getting ready for it. And I think he overhears them talking in the bedroom and crying and such. And he's like, oh, they're actually feeling emotions. They just don't show it to me. And I feel like,
Yeah.
again, they're trying to work things out as adults behind a closed door rather than with their son.
Yeah, it's kind of like you were saying, it almost does feel like miscommunication because they are all to an extent processing what's going on. I think King maybe less so, which is understandable since he's a child.
Mm.
But because they're not like reaching out about it and they're not showing that they're what they're going through, it feels like King feels like he's alone in this and that he's the only one who misses Khalid like constantly. Um yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I'm sure our discussion of grief will come up again throughout.
Yes.
um, but another obviously big element or theme of the book is the intersection of race and sexuality, specifically racism and homophobia, um, and like the way that those kind of prejudices can intermingle, but also in some people they're separate. Like somebody might be one and not the other. Um, which we see several examples of characters in this book who might be like horribly racist, but like they don't have a problem with, you know, their brother, for example, being gay. So yeah, just any thoughts on how the novel approaches this topic of intersectionality in these very specific ways?
I feel like there's so many ways that it talks
Yes.
about it. Where do we
It's a
start?
big question. Yeah.
Um, I definitely think like Sandy's journey versus King's journey. I guess in many ways their journeys kind of reflect each other, but are very different from each other. And just the way that Sandy talks about being gay and like discovering that he's gay, and he has so much boldness in him in saying these statements, even though he's definitely still processing it and hurting because of it due to how people react around him. But I feel like he so clearly almost misses King's points sometimes when he's talking,
Mm,
when King's like, doesn't even dare to say the word gay, or he can't even start to think of himself in that way entirely, because he, even though he's a child, he understands that there's more to it. He understands
mhm.
that he's like penalized for being black, or will be judged for being black already, and he's like, I see what Sandy's going through, and if that was me it would be even worse. I think he kind of subconsciously understands that. So I think in their relationship and in the ways in which just King doesn't say so much. Like there's so much he holds within him, and there's so much that Sandy just says that reflects that duality of how intersectionality complicates so much.
Yes. And there's even a moment where King thinks to himself, but again, he doesn't say this to Sandy, but when he is thinking about like the similarities in what he experiences as a black child and what Sandy experiences as a gay child, like he does think about a lot of the similarities, but he also has that thought of like, I wonder if it's different because people can tell by looking at me and they can't tell by looking at him,
Mm.
which I think is a really interesting point because he's not saying that one is okay, you know, and one isn't. He's just saying that like it is a different kind of experience, and I think that maybe I feel like that's one of the things that this book is saying is like not to compare, you know, prejudice to talk about which one is worse or, you
Mm.
know, like anything like that, but to just say that there is common ground that can be useful and that can be found to approach these ideas, but it's like you don't want to think that you can understand what it's like to be somebody else, you know, like you can use things that you have in common to understand a little bit, but it's not like Sandy. I think for a kid his age he does a better job than maybe would be expected of like listening to what King says about how his experience is different. But even though Sandy does experience really horrible things, you know, from his father and just from people in general for being gay, it doesn't mean that he understands everything about what it's like to be a black kid, especially in the South, you know, like,
Mm.
yeah.
And you mentioned like Sandy's father, and I do think again the outcome with the parents kind of reflects how there is intersectionality, but you can't say which situation is worse or not, because in the end, Sandy's dad just full out doesn't accept him, and don't know if he ever will. Whereas King's parents are like coming around to accepting him and are willing to accept him and love him nonetheless. But they have fear, like there's a lot of fear that they have for him as a Black young man growing up, and now they've got another layer of fear for him. And that's where they say like a lot of their initial reaction comes from or stems from.
Yeah.
And yeah, there is a lot of, well, I guess in both cases there's a lot of internalized things parents and people around you have to work through to be able to continue on.
Yeah. Well, and like King's father even says to him, or maybe King is like thinking back to other things that they've said, but like black men can't be gay, you know, that's just not something that can happen or that should happen. So yeah, there's definitely, the book definitely looks at the way that different prejudices can overlap, but they don't always. Yeah. Also, Olivia-Savannah, you were doing a beautiful job of just leading us into the next question, because the next one I wanted to talk about is, what does this book say about people being able to change their minds, like, and change their perspectives?
I feel like what I really liked about this book and the ending of it was that it talks about different ranges of changing minds. And I do think not all the time in middle grade queer books, but sometimes there's a effort to like show the positive reactions only, and to kind of not dodge the hard conversations, but essentially you miss the hard conversations of what if you're a child and you tell your parents this is who I am and they don't accept you. And I appreciated that this book kind of tackled that head on and showed how there are unfortunately people who are not going to change their minds, even though that is horrible, but it shows that people can change their minds and should do if they love someone. And then there's people who don't even need their minds changed because they already accept you and love you. And it kind of, across the characters, it did a very good job of showing all those different depictions of reactions and learning and growing. Yeah.
Yes. I agree with everything you said. I think that it did a really wonderful job of showing the many different reactions you can get from people. And I think especially in a middle grade novel, it is so important for kids to see that not that it isn't important to have a like completely supportive relationship, because it is, but I really like that the book shows that like even if things don't start out that way, you can still have people in your life who love you. Like when King and his dad are talking near the end of the book, and like his dad says like, you know, I admit it was a little hard for me, like I'm still figuring out how I feel about it. And then King, I was so glad that he spoke up and said something. He's like, well, you saying you have to think about it hurts, you know, it makes me think like, why can't you just accept me without having to think about it? And his dad ends up saying like, you know, I don't understand, but I know I love you. And that's really the only thing that matters, and something that's never going to change, and everything else we can kind of figure out as we go. And I think that that was a really good balance of, yeah, acknowledging the really hard conversations and the fact that people might not support you immediately, but that like there is hope. There are people out there who are willing to learn and to do better, which I really, really liked seeing. And again, it's something that like happens because of communication, because for a long time, I mean, it feels like a long time, King doesn't know, like he's assuming that his parents hate him because they haven't said anything to him after he came out. And so it's not until his dad like says, we need to talk about this, that they actually get it out in the open. And King realizes that they've been loving him the whole time. They were just waiting for him once again to say something, which is like, I think at this point, you guys need to accept that your son is not going to say something first.
That's not the right way to handle it. But
Like that's just not gonna work for King. But yeah, I thought that was a really great element
mhm.
of the book. So
That was basically one of my favorite moments. And
yes, that was
um,
the part that made me tear up.
yeah, I can understand why.
Yeah.
And I think the like direct quote that he says is like, I guess it's not that hard when I love you this much. And
Hmm.
I think it was such a good way of saying, like, you know, the dad needs to continue to unpack some of the
Yes.
internalized hate that he's got within him. And changing your mind does take time, and changing your mind does take education, and it's hard, but it's also not that hard at the same time. And
Yeah.
I think that speech just encapsulated the duality of it not being that difficult.
Exactly. It's like the details are incredibly complicated and messy, and figuring out how to see, like when his dad says, I have to start thinking of you differently, and that is hard. Like all
Mm,
of that is messy, but the basic underlying point is very, very simple, which is that you love someone, and that's all
yeah.
that matters. And you don't have to be the same as them. You don't have to understand what it's like to be them. You just have to love and like be willing to listen, when they tell you.
And I think I find it when like Case and Calendar use that language, I thought it very interesting because often like I need to start thinking of you differently is something I mostly see in like trans fiction or like trans
Mm.
books where they're like,
Mhm.
this is a new like a new identity that I haven't seen you as before, so I need to think of you differently. But I think it's good to acknowledge that when someone is coming out to you in any which way, it is a new element to their identity that you haven't been able to see before. And I guess it again emphasizes the thing that we talked about earlier with like, what does it mean to be intersectional? Because Black is visible and easy to see, and you always immediately think of someone within that context. Um, so yeah, I just appreciated that it kind of didn't eradicate that. Yes, this is a big moment for them.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. And it doesn't make them irredeemable people because
Yes.
they are struggling a little with rethinking some things. Um, Also, so kind of related to our discussion of, the various prejudices that this book talks about, I also thought it was really interesting. This wasn't like a main theme, but it comes up a lot when King and Sandy are talking, and also King hears from his parents. Um, the idea of holding kids responsible for like the things that their parents have done.
Mm,
So I don't know if you had any specific thoughts on that. Like I think the big example is Sandy and his family.
mm.
His father and grandfather are and brother are atrocious human beings. Um, and so there is kind of an instinct or a tendency for some of the other characters to think he's the same way, or to almost like hold him responsible in place of his family. Um, so yeah, I don't know if you had specific like thoughts on that, if that was something that you noticed in the novel.
I did notice it, and I liked how I did like what was said about it. How Sandy was like, "It's not my fault that that happened. I can't change that," but also he apologizes to King on their
Yes.
behalf and like acknowledges that there is a pain there that still exists, that is still carried through the generations. Yeah, I don't have too much more to say about that because I feel like it was mentioned but not like the focus. But I
Right.
appreciate that it was mentioned because there's a lot of things like mentalities that are carried down. Like the book across in different ways talks about mentalities that are carried down and like habits that are carried down. And again, I think it kind of depicts the way that there's a break in thinking, there's a change in minds that goes on in Sandy's like family as you go down to where Sandy is and doesn't think that way.
Yeah. And I think too that when Sandy uses that, like he compares that to the way that King reacted and treated him when he found out he was gay. I think it's interesting that Sandy like explicitly says like you're doing the exact same thing. And I think that's an oversimplification in a way, because as we were talking about, like it shouldn't be about like comparing
Mm,
comparing prejudices and experiences, but I do think that is a valuable connection to make, which is that if you, yeah, just like if you are so focused on what other people have done, it might make you judge somebody who didn't do that.
Mm.
Yeah, I just thought that was interesting. Again, like oversimplifying, but I think it makes sense, especially for like a kid to be like, but that's not fair. You're doing the same thing. Cause like,
Mm.
it's true.
Because ultimately, when you come down to it, discrimination is discrimination, but
Yeah.
homophobic discrimination and ethnicity related discrimination, they will all look different, but it's still discrimination. And I feel like it's one of the arguments for, there's many arguments for intersectionality, but the fact that you're all suffering under this,
Yes.
under an oppression, is something that should be uniting and shouldn't, you should be able to look at these differences, because a lot of the way that the oppressors like weaponize discrimination is by trying to isolate the different groups. And
Yes. By stopping people from working together.
mm,
Um, and I think like Sandy almost like implicitly says this. Like he doesn't come right out and say it, I don't think. But um like you're saying, it's like when he's comparing these things, he's basically making the point that like they look different, but they come from the same place.
mm,
Like it's the
yeah.
exact same like root cause. Um, which I think is a good point.
Can I throw a red herring in? Because
Yes.
we were talking about Sandy's brother and like the discrimination that goes down the generations, but I found it very interesting, like the depiction of the brother, because I feel like maybe I'm stealing one of your questions from later, but um, the depiction of the brother, because Sandy, like obviously his brother helps him, and
Yeah.
Sandy sees his brother fondly and doesn't entirely acknowledge the racist claims against his brother. And in the end, we don't actually know if the rumor about Mickey having hurt or killed a black man is true.
Yeah.
So, like, how did you feel about that?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, especially because like the whole time, like I realized it by the end of the book when um yeah, Sandy's brother, like Mikey does help him out. He takes
Mm,
him away from that abusive home. um I realized when I got to that part, I was like, oh, I've been reading this whole book just assuming that like Mikey did that, like that he did actually, because and I still think it's very likely,
mm,
because he certainly doesn't do a lot to contradict that view of himself, like the way that he talks to King,
mm-hmm.
and just I don't know, just the way that he like treats people.
But at the
um
same time, he doesn't actually do, like, I
I
was
know,
really
yeah.
wondering about this, because even when King comes to the house and like he's kind of like, you've got to stay away from here, it could be malicious, but it could also be protective of the harm that King may come to if he comes face to face with the dad. And I fully, even though it's a short book, I was like, I feel like there's more to this whole Mikey, so I'm forgetting his name, and his brother relationship. I was like, I feel like there's
Yeah.
more here, but we're not seeing it. We don't confirm these rumors, and he's too much on the periphery for me to see if I'm reading something into this or if it's just as black and white as it is on the page. So
Yeah.
I was wondering what you thought about it.
That's a really good point. And also because if we look at other things that happen in the book, a lot of it kind of does deal with rumors and
Mm,
what people have heard and if that's true or not. So that's really interesting. Yeah. Because I think I was reading Mikey as an example of one of those characters who is very prejudiced in one way and not another. But yeah, there is a possibility that it isn't that clear cut. Um, Good question.
it's hard to tell.
It is. And I think that's another strength of the novel is that there are little pieces that are not like fully explained, but not in an
Mhm.
annoying way. Just like, what does this make you think about the way that you think about people,
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah. Um, Also, we talked a little bit about this in passing, but I also think something that gets brought up a lot in this book, specifically by King's like first person narration, um, is the idea of bravery. And he calls himself a coward a lot. Um, but we see other people viewing him differently. He also views Sandy as being really brave. And something that I think is really interesting is that, as far as I can remember, none of the ways that characters use the word brave in this book is like, I think, what people might automatically think of. You know, it's a very like quiet kind of bravery that comes from internal strength. And so I don't know if you had, I don't know, any specific like comments on that. Like I wrote it down as like the bravery of being yourself.
Mm.
Um, so I don't know if you had like comments on that as just like a concept or like specifically in a middle grade book.
I did. I thought like both like King and Sandy were really, really brave.
Yeah.
I I'm impressed by Sandy just being so young and being like, actually, this is not how I should be treated. I've had enough. I'm going to run away. And it's like maybe his ideas of running away and how he was going to do it aren't the safest, aren't the best.
Yeah.
But I do think it's really brave to be able to see that you're in a bad situation, you've had enough, and it's time to escape it best you can. Adults struggle with that. He
Yeah.
was going for it. I feel like King was brave so many times. He kept speaking, like especially when he told his mum what was happening and his mum didn't listen and he didn't let
Yes.
that be the last word. He kept trying to do the right thing. I was like, that is very brave.
Yeah. I think like King is a really like he makes mistakes, of course. But he is a really admirable person, and like I think he underestimates the kind of bravery it takes to just like speak
Mm,
in situations like that, like to argue with adults when you know something is wrong and they're not
mm.
listening. That's pretty amazing. Um
I
yeah, and
also
I yeah, go ahead.
just want to also throw that I think Jasmine and Brianna were also brave. Jasmine to
Yes.
tell the person that she fancies him best she can, and Brianna to go up to King at the end and just try and make him feel as comfortable as possible
Yes.
before he faces all the friends. I thought they were also very brave.
Yes, I wrote them down, Jasmine specifically, but I also really liked Brianna. And I really admire Jasmine too for like she is understandably very upset at the way that King, you know, like lied to her or I don't know, not coming out to someone isn't the same as lying, but like he did kind of let her think that he like he could have just said I don't really want to date anyone right now.
Mm,
Although obviously I understand why he didn't, but I really like that Jasmine didn't like almost blame him, you know, for like being gay or for not coming out to her soon enough. It was more just like, well, you didn't have to pretend to date me, you know.
yeah, yeah.
Um which I think is very impressive, especially for, you know, a preteen like to have that kind of maturity. Um yeah, and I think going back to Sandy, just like the bravery of living as yourself, like as a young gay child in this community with the kind of father he has is pretty amazing. Um and when he says to King like cuz King's basically like, "Well, you just keep making things harder for yourself. Like
Mm,
why even tell people?" And Sandy is basically like, "Well, there's no chance I'm going to be happy if I don't. You know, I
yeah,
don't know that this will work out." And he's like, "Are you happy, King?" And King realizes that he's not,
yeah.
which is like so heartbreaking. He's like, "I never thought about it. I'm really really unhappy. Like I just don't like my the way things are going right now."
Mm,
But I think it's important that Sandy says that to him because I think that does have a big impact on King and on wanting to try to live more authentically.
mm,
Yeah. And okay, last theme question. I also love that this book addresses toxic masculinity. So I just kind of wanted to talk about the different examples because I feel like that's one of the more like subtle themes because like this book is very obviously like a book about grief and a book about race and homophobia, but then it also I think deals with toxic masculinity and like gender roles and sexism in really thoughtful but not like flashy ways. So
mm.
let's discuss.
Yes, I do think like the whole dad situation talks about toxic masculinity a lot,
Mm-hmm.
but I particularly loved the like really small subplot where I think it's Daryl doesn't want to date
Yes,
Brianna because she's too tall.
she's too tall. Yeah.
I was like, what? And he so clearly like would date her
Yes,
otherwise. And Brianna, I really liked Brianna as a character
I
because
did too.
she just seems like she's vibing, she's living her life, she's tall, she's not like slouching or trying to hide it, she's just being
Yeah.
herself. And
Yeah.
Daryl has to get over himself and just be like, I can date someone who's taller than me, that's okay.
Yes, yes. I loved that subplot too, and I also really loved just Brianna as a character, and like she also is very very like confident in herself, and like she has kind of that bravery of just like existing and not like apologizing for it. And like the fact that she immediately comes up to King after and is like, "Hey, thanks for getting Daryl to get over himself." Like I just yeah, Brianna's great. Um
But yes, there's also like everything with the dad, and it's interesting because the dad's like, I need time to change my mind and think through things I've been taught. But from the beginning of the novel, he's already doing that because he's lost his son and
yeah.
has to learn that crying is okay and saying I love you to, like, he has so much regret within
Yes.
him that, and that must really complicate the grief process. But he's already working through so much that I was kind of proud of him because King doesn't
Yeah.
say I love you back the first few times, but he still
Right,
says,
and he still does it.
mm,
Yeah,
but
no, I love that too. Yeah, I think that King's father is a really, really complex character, and I really like that kind of like we were saying with, you know, people can change their minds. Um, I like that both of his parents really, but especially his dad, it's not like a cut and dry, like you are a supportive parent or you're like Sandy's dad, you know, like there's room to grow.
mm,
Um, yeah, I mean, going back to like one of my favorite scenes, which is their conversation at Mardi Gras, and like at the end, when King says, "I love you, Dad," and like it makes him smile for the first time in like so long. It's just, yeah, I thought their relationship was really beautiful. Um,
I was also going to say I find the one with his brother Khalid was also interesting because like
yes,
they kind of they did embody it because they'd been taught that way, like saying love you bro in a playful way rather than saying they love each other, and like Callie turning off the films when it got too scary rather than
yes,
them talking about it. So they were kind of supporting each other throughout it, but it does lead to like what Callie had said about sexuality before
yes,
passing away, which is a very difficult thing to deal with in grief, where somebody said something that hurts and they will never have the opportunity to talk about that more to see if they would have grown or not, or what they meant by it or not.
yeah,
Um, and I do think toxic masculinity has a lot to do with that, a lot to do
yeah,
with not having properly explained and just said a statement and just left it at that.
yeah. Um, and I really love that the way that King and his parents kind of finally address that or deal with it, because his parents didn't know that this had happened, is once again King does like speak up and communicate about it, and then that gives them the opportunity to say, you know, it's like we don't know exactly what he would have said, it might have taken him time, but like he would have never hated you, like he loves you so much that there is nothing about you that could change, you know, like I think that's really beautiful, but it's also a very meaningful way to address it, because they're not saying like oh don't worry about it. There's, you know, they're like acknowledging he shouldn't have said it, but they're
Mm-hmm.
saying like this was what he's been taught talking, rather than how he actually feels about you.
Mm-hmm.
Um yeah. Okay, so moving into characters. Um I think we kind of talked about Khalid already. Yeah, I just thought that was really well handled. Like, I think his characterization was so good. It's like we don't ever meet him, you know,
Yes.
obviously, but he's such an important part of the book, and I think that's really, um, I mean, that's really key to what the story's about and King's character.
Mm.
Um,
How
And
did
also,
you?
like we were saying, how messy grief is when somebody has hurt you.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, any thoughts on Khalid as a character?
I thought it was a very good depiction of the character that we never actually get to meet. And all of the flashbacks with the conversations I found really interesting because it showed how much of a deep thinker he really was,
Yeah.
which I think was just a great way to add to his character. But I was wondering how you felt about the like metaphor of him being a dragonfly, a firefly,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, Dragonfly.
Dragonfly, sorry.
Oh, you're fine. Yeah, I thought that was, I mean, the first sentence of the book is so good. Like, I'm just gonna read it.
Go for it.
um, the dragonflies live down by the bayou, but there's no way to know which one's my brother. Like, what a way to start off a
Mm,
novel. Um, so I think from that perspective, it's like, a really interesting writing technique. But the thing that struck me about it this time, um, is that it is surprising to me how King that processes his loss without viewing his brother as a dragonfly, like without any external input, really.
mm,
Like he is so sure that his brother is a dragonfly for like so much of the book. And I understand why he would like cling to that. And then
mm,
he does talk a little bit to his aunt Idris, when he talks, he's like, do you think people that we lose are still here? And she says, oh, yes, of course. So, like, he does have some kind of input, but I just think it is so interesting that because he's finally like talking and communicating and like processing his grief more, all of a sudden he's just like, I've known the whole time he wasn't a dragonfly, and now I need to like live that.
mm.
Um, yeah, I don't know if that made sense at all,
Yeah,
but
no, it did. It did. Yeah, yeah. And I think he's such an internal character that him going and watching the dragonflies was a way for him to have some time alone.
yeah.
And children don't always get that much time alone.
Mhm.
There's always like parents in the house, and oftentimes parents can come in whenever they want,
Yeah.
or you're with your friends and everything. And he had that time where he could just contemplate. And he wasn't he was watching the dragonflies, but he was mostly just waiting. And I feel like a lot of this book is him waiting to feel okay, because
Yeah.
someone would say something and they're like, oh, King, you're crying, or like he would feel that he had tears on his face and didn't notice it. And it just seemed like, yeah, he was waiting for his parents to speak. He was waiting for his friends to like not say offhand cruel things about gay people. Like there was a lot of things that he was waiting for it to happen. And I guess as the events unfold, he starts acting himself more and more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just thought it was an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that makes the book feel so cathartic, with how, like, even though it is so much about grief, and that's, the loss of Khalid is always going to be difficult. It's always going to hurt. But like that moment near the end when he and his parents are finally all just like sobbing together, it's like finally, because it's like they can finally like show how upset they are and like how difficult this is, and not pretend that they're okay, and only by doing that can they start feeling more okay, because they start like looking at photo albums and like telling funny stories. And
Mm,
yeah.
yeah,
It's a really beautiful book.
it is. It
I
really
love
is.
it. I'm so glad I got an excuse to reread it. um let's see, we actually talked a lot about like most of the characters I have here. We talked about Sandy a lot, and we've obviously been talking about King throughout because he's the main character. But one thing that I think is interesting about him, and we mentioned this, is he makes he makes some mistakes, um, some like pretty significant ones. Like when he basically outs Sandy, um, to those other kids. But I think that even though we're not supposed to think that's okay, I feel like it's written in a way that is understandable. Um, And I think King has, like, he has to make so many difficult decisions
Mm,
about like who to talk to and when to talk. And I think like the thing he does at the end when he tells Sandy, I can't run away with you, I think that is incredibly brave
mm,
for so many reasons. Because not only is he like saying to his best friend, one of his best friends, um, and somebody who he obviously cares a lot about, you know, in whatever way. I know that they might have had a crush on each other at one point. Um, this person he really cares about, he's having to say like, no, I can't go with you. But also the fact that he tells an adult about what's going on. And like I remember from being a kid, like knowing when to like break a promise to someone because of like a safety thing, that is like such a stressful thing for like a kid to have to decide, is like,
yeah.
is this one of the times where I need to actually tell an adult? um I'm just like so incredibly proud of King for like for handling that the way he did. And um yeah, I think his character growth is is really good. So any other thoughts on King as a protagonist?
Just connecting to what you said, there's so much, like throughout this novel, he keeps making promises to people, and I feel like that was the like moment where he really gets when to break it or not, because he does break Sandy's promise by telling other people that he's gay, but then he doesn't break Sandy's promise about the first time he runs away. And I think there's like a promise to Jasmine that he breaks or something, and he's
Yes,
and
something. Yeah.
Jasmine's like, why didn't you tell me? Like, that's something you should have done. But he was obviously trying to keep Sandy's promise this time because he'd broken it another time. So he's like
Yeah.
trying to juggle those decisions and not let different people down for different reasons. And I appreciated seeing how complicated it could get. It was enough to make
Yes.
me feel nervous having like
Yeah.
watching those decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I also like when people are so upset with him for not saying that he knew where Sandy was. I mean, the fact that he did not tell anyone when he like saw him at the bayou,
Mm,
that I think was, that felt more like, okay, yeah, you probably should have told someone that, because like we
yes.
thought he was like genuinely missing.
Yeah.
But I also understand why he didn't, because he's scared.
Yeah.
um But then the time when everyone gets mad at him because he didn't say that he was helping him hide, I was like,
Mm,
I feel like King did the right thing though, because he finds out that Sandy ran away from an abusive home. And I think that is a circumstance where, like, you know, telling an adult where a kid is not actually the best thing for them.
yeah.
Um, and I like that his parents eventually realized that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah,
And
I was so upset when his mom didn't believe
didn't
him.
do anything the first time. I was like, oh my gosh. I
Yeah.
can't, I was like that. I couldn't believe that moment. I was like, oh. But
Yeah.
I was gonna say I also really liked his friends. I think it was Anthony and Brianna who were giving him the benefit of the doubt. Like he didn't tell
Yes.
anyone, and they were like, well, he might have reasons. You don't know. And even though King didn't tell those reasons then and there, I appreciate that there were kids with deep enough thinking to be like, maybe we should hear reasons before we judge.
Yes. Yes. A lot of mature kids in this book,
There are a lot of mature kids.
but
I
like
didn't
in
think that.
believable ways. It's like
Yeah.
it still feels like Kacen Callender is like writing them as like truly children, you know?
Mm.
Um, yeah. Also, I just want to give a shout out to Auntie Idris because I loved her. She
Oh
was
yeah,
barely in the book, but like I love her.
fantastic.
Such a great character. Um, yeah, any other characters before we move on to our last couple questions? I mean, we did talk about his parents quite a bit. I overall think they were really well written. I that moment with his mom, just like that's the like sticking point for me, because I overall think she's like doing her best, you know.
Mm.
But that's that one thing where I'm like, how could you not even like investigate like when your kid says something like that, especially because they know King wouldn't bring that up for no reason, you
Yeah.
know, like
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know how I feel about them. I feel like she, in some ways, I felt like she was having a quiet revolution of her own. The fact that she didn't go back to cooking afterwards and
Yes.
just kind of watched the dad make the meal and was like, this is good, isn't it? You can cook. I was like, I see what you're doing there. But there were also times where I was like, I really would have wanted you to speak up here, because obviously she didn't agree with some things, but didn't say
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah. Or even that moment when, like, again, King very, very impressively, at the end of the book is like kind of calling his parents on some of the ways they've mishandled things. And he mentions his mom not even speaking to him for a week after he came out. And she says something like, I wanted you to come to us on your own. I didn't want to overwhelm you with questions. And now I think that was the wrong choice. And I'm like, I understand why she like would have not wanted to freak him out, but also, as we've been saying, I'm like, King is never gonna like come forward with questions. Like, I I think she was so afraid of getting it wrong, of like making him feel worse, that she's like, well, if I just don't say anything, that's better than saying the wrong thing. And I'm like, I don't know, because even if she had said it in a way that could have been worded better, just saying something about like, well, we love you,
Yeah.
I don't get it, but I love you. Like that would have been way better than just absolute silence for a whole week. Like,
And also what really frustrated me about that was he said, like, I think in that conversation, he was like, I wanted to talk to you. And then something happens and they have a disagreement. And then she goes back to not talking to him again until the trip. And I was like,
yeah,
he just vocalized that the
yeah,
not talking thing wasn't working, but you're going back to it.
yeah,
I was like, I do think I resonate with I think she says it to Auntie Idris, like, I don't know how to say the right thing. And from books that I've read with parents in them, they often have a moment where they're like, I don't know how to talk to my child. Like, I really don't know what they're going through.
yeah,
But I think it doesn't mean you should stop trying. And
yeah,
clearly she knew him better than the father, because I think there was a point where they were like, move up on the table, and he was reluctant, and the mom was like, why don't you move next to me instead? Like, she understands him a bit more.
yeah,
So I was just like, I don't know how to think about you.
yeah, yeah. The parents also make mistakes in the novel.
uh,
Um, yeah. Okay, so thoughts on the ending. And I guess this is kind of a related question. How do you feel about the overall balance of hope and realism in the book?
I
Like,
feel
how
like
successful do you think?
I
Yeah,
feel like it was very realistic. Like, it was realistic. Ultimate, like, you can say King gets a happy ending, but you also know that he has to go back to school and have some difficult conversations with his friends. Like, it's not all resolved by the end, and he keeps repeating like it's going to be okay, and has faith in that and has hope in that. So it kind of ends in hope. And but at the same time, like, Sandy gets a happy ending. He's living with his brother. He's probably safer now, but also Sandy's got to go back to school at some point and face all of those people that did isolate him because he was gay, and his father is like not with him. So I think it did a good job of balancing the realism and the
yeah.
hopeful.
I agree. I think like this is a really good example of middle grade books that don't sugarcoat things, but they still have a meaningful amount of hope, which I think is important for books for kids, especially because if they read this and they identify with King, I think it is so important that they know that things can be okay, and that they do have, like, there are people out there who will love them and help them no matter what. And I think that is so important when authors are writing books for children. But I also think, just in general, I think, like, I don't want to get too far into this, but I think even books for adults could stand to have a little bit more balance, because I mean it's for like very practical reasons, because like if you never see things work out, I genuinely think it is harder to make that happen in the real world, you know. Um there's like a quote from, I think it's Bell Hooks, and I don't remember the exact wording, but it's like about like not reading books for like for reality or to see what the world is, but reading books to know what's possible. And I feel like that is one of the values of fiction, is that it helps us imagine better. Um, which I think that this one does.
And I do think nonfiction can do it, veering off of
Yes.
middle grade. I think I read Know My Name this year by Chanel Miller, which was absolutely brutal, but also Punching the Air by Ibi Zoboi and Yusuf Salam. And both of those are
Yes.
tackling such devastating stories and intense
Yes.
stories, but both of them managed to have semblances of hope in them.
Yeah.
And I think it can be done. It's not always done, but it can be done.
Right. And I think it's just like practical as well, like going along with what you said about nonfiction. Um, and actually, your book pick that I'm reading right now, Consumed, I'm only at the beginning, but I feel like it's like I've seen more of a trend lately, which makes me really happy for climate nonfiction that it's not like it's overly cheery or optimistic, but they have the perspective of like there are still things we can do. And I think people have like this instinct that if something is realistic it has to be depressing. And it's
Mm,
like no, because like think about like when has it ever been productive to tell people there's nothing we can do, there's no hope? Like why would you
mm,
tell someone that and then expect them to do something? um
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay. And let's see. I think that's pretty much all I had. Um any like quotes or scenes we want to talk about or specific thoughts on anything else? I also uh I personally just really love the writing style of this book. I think it's really clear and it has the perfect amount of like description, um and like balancing all the different characters, and like I just think like it's a very unobtrusive but also still very thoughtful writing style. So,
Mm, I agree. I think also a question I'd throw your way is if people enjoyed King and the Dragonflies, as they should, because it's wonderful, what book would you recommend they pick up next for something like
ooh,
similar that they might like?
that is a great question. Let me go to my Goodreads real quick. And as I do that, are there any particular scenes that you want to mention? Like I talked about the conversation between him and his dad at Mardi Gras
Mm,
is one of like the most like beautiful, but also like I think really encapsulates what this book does really well, which is that like it acknowledges that things are going to be hard, but people love you anyway.
I think I do think that was my favorite scene as well. Like I really did like it a lot. I also really liked the scene with Auntie Idris when she talks about how she lost her grandfather, I think it is,
Mhm.
and how that pain doesn't entirely go away but abates. And when I was a child as well, like I was 10, and my grandfather passed away and I was struggling with it in school, a teacher pulled me aside and talked about when her mum passed and said something quite similar. And so that scene kind of reminded me of that. And I found it like experiencing grief before, I think it's very, very true. And it's a very tangible way of talking about it with a child to kind of show that things get better in time, but it's okay to hurt still in a way that they can probably imagine and understand. So I really like that scene too.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Okay, so a couple of recommendations if you did enjoy King and the Dragonflies. The Sea in Winter by Christine Day is one I read recently, and this is a really beautiful book that deals like it does talk about grief, but it's more about the loss that you can feel in other ways because our main character is a young girl who loves ballet. She's been doing it for years. That's always been what she wants to do professionally, and that's been like what her whole kind of life is focused around. And she has an injury and she's not sure if she'll ever be able to dance again. And she's having a really hard time communicating to people what this loss is like because it's not like she's lost a person in her life, you
Mm.
know. It's a kind of grief or loss that I think is a lot harder to understand. And I also think similarly to King and the Dragonflies, I think the family characters and relationships are done really well. I think the Sea in Winter, they're even more positive and supportive. Um, but like Maisie, our main character, she is going through a lot. Like she has like anxiety. I can't remember if she has depression as well, but like she's just really struggling. And it's really nice to see that she has this support system, and it's kind of just about her learning to use that support system. Um, so I think that one is good. If you want something that is a little more on the lighthearted side, Playing the Cards You're Dealt by Varian Johnson is fantastic. And also, it deals a lot with toxic masculinity, and I love that. I love that we're seeing that in middle grade books. That makes me so happy. Um, yeah, and that one is really fun. And that one, I think, also has some really interesting things to say about friendships being complicated. And also, like, our main character, he wants to enter this tournament with his best friend, and then his best friend can't do it. And so he ends up working with a new girl in his class, and his friend's like, you can't compete with a girl. That's weird. So it deals with that in, I think, really appropriate ways for the age audience. And then my last recommendation is Ivelisse Explains It All by Andrea Beatriz Arango. This is a novel in verse that is so beautiful, and it is, all of these are middle grade, by the way. And our main character, Ivelisse, she has depression and PTSD, I think is what it officially is. And it gets pretty heavy at times. Definitely like be in a good headspace when you read this one, but I thought it was so beautifully done, and I think it does a really fantastic job of showing that kids can have problems like this. You know, it's not like you have to be like, 15 years old or older to like have depression or something like that. And yeah, I just thought it was a really beautiful book. It made me cry a lot. And it deals too with having family members that you love and who love you, but who are struggling to understand different parts of you, because her grandmother comes to stay with them for a while, and they've always been really close, but like her grandmother has a very negative view of medication and therapy. And so it's about Ivelisse working through that as well. So anyway, that was a lot of talking, but I love that question, Olivia-Savannah.
Yeah, I like the recommendations. I do really want to read that last one. It's on my to-read
Yes,
list.
it's so good. Also, I'm gonna make a note that I will link the books I mentioned after we end the live show. Do you have any recommendations, Olivia-Savannah?
I guess Melissa by Alex Gino, which is the one I talked about briefly previously, about a girl who realizes that she's trans and wants to kind of communicate this to the people around her. And I think similarly to King and the Dragonflies, it does a good job of showing how different people can react differently and the realistic depiction of those reactions. And then because of the lack of speaking is something I was really interested in King and the Dragonflies. For an adult nonfiction one, this I know is far from middle grade, I would recommend Things I Have Withheld by Kai Miller. And he's a Black, gay Jamaican man who spends a lot of time in Jamaica, but then also Britain and a few countries in Africa. And each essay is about something that he wished he had said but didn't say, and then why and how that came about to be. So I think those are two.
I added that one after you talked about it. I thought that sounded so good.
It's great.
Okay, so I will link all of those books in the description. Yeah, I think that's everything. Our next book, we're doing things a little out of order. So Olivia-Savannah will not be on our next one, but she will be in the future. I'll go ahead and I think I linked the schedule announcement, so I explained it there. But Hannah from Ball Gowns and Books is going to be joining me next time, and we're going to be discussing The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. So very different vibe. It's a classic. But that's
still middle grade.
Still middle grade, that's right. And I think it's going to be a really interesting one to compare to the retelling that we're going to read. Okay, I think that's everything I have. Thank you so much, Olivia-Savannah, for joining me and for bringing your thoughtful, insightful comments and questions, as always.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, I loved doing this. And thank you if you tuned in. Thank you to people who watch it back. I know we always get people who watch later, which is so kind of you. um, yeah, anything to add, Olivia-Savannah?
I think that's it from me, but thank you for making me read this book because it has been on my shelf for too long and I
Good.
really enjoyed it.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad. I loved it as well. It's a great excuse to get to reread it. All right. Thank you, everyone.
See ya.
Bye.